Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be finishing up our look at the original Team 7 miniseries with Team 7 number 4. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in February of 1995, I really like this cover a lot, despite the fact that it's rather stark and bleak. I think it's really cool looking. However, I struggle to kind of understand exactly what it has to do with the interior and the story that happens inside of this book. I really think that the artist involved, Aaron Wiesenfeld, just was like, I got a cool idea for a cover. Here it is. Have fun with it. On the inside cover, we are greeted with an advertisement for the Spawn trading card set. Now, initially, almost all, if not all, of the Image books had the credits on the inside cover and all of the legal mumbo jumbo down at the bottom. And then the further we got into it, the more we started to see books start out with an advertisement. Now, this is a common practice that you see with Marvel and DC books all the time, but with Image, they always started with the credits initially. Now, it doesn't get to the point where every book always has an ad on the reverse inside or on the inside cover like this, but it becomes more prominent the further you get into the 90s. And the Spawn trading card set, I think I've talked about them before here on the channel. I had some of these. Personally, I didn't like them. Number one, most of the artwork was done by random artists, and I didn't think it was all that great. Number two, the trading cards themselves were a really awkward size that no other trading card was. They were the same width, but like an inch taller. So if you had trading card sleeves and binders, they didn't fit in them correctly. So where were you supposed to store these things? The whole idea just seemed ill-conceived from the start. And while I can appreciate Todd trying to think outside of the box and like flip the script a little bit, I feel like he honestly just missed the mark entirely with the Spawn trading cards. Now, into the story. Chuck Dixon, story. Aaron Wiesenfeld, pencils. J.D. and Scott Williams, inks. Bill Oakley, letters. Monica Benet, color. We can see here that the book starts off where we left off in issue 3, where Deathblow has been placed under arrest by the captain of the ship that he's on and is being led to the brig in the bowels of the ship. I want to point out that the background of this entire page is spectacular. Look at all of this detail that was drawn in here. And by the way, it's not just one page, as you're going to see the further we get in. The men leading Deathblow to the brig are kind of taunting him a little, stating, you got yourself in trouble now. You mouthed off to the captain and to the higher-ups in Washington, and now you're going to pay for it. And if you don't settle down, we're going to slap some irons on you. And at this point, Deathblow realizes that he's only got to contend with 3 other soldiers and states, yeah, there's only one way you're going to be slapping irons on me. Deathblow then states that it will be in a pine box that they put his irons on him, as he immediately catches the man behind him with an upward elbow as the man fires off a shot, hitting no one. However, the sound of this would have been deafening in such a small metallic tube. At this point, one of the other guards tries to draw his revolver. The CO tries to tell Deathblow to stand down, but before he can even finish his sentence, Deathblow grabs him by the back of the head and smashes his face into the wall, knocking him out cold, as this man is now left alone to try and face off against Deathblow, who is unarmed and shouldn't be a problem, but we've seen now that he is easily far more capable in combat than any of the men trying to lead him to the brig. Also, again, with this highly detailed background, it's so good, and I want to point out that this background was being redrawn for every single page that it's used on because there are slight differences between each page. For instance, right here, you can see this seam on the graded floor is not exactly in the same spot in both of these pages. That means Aaron was literally redrawing this entire background for every single page. He wasn't just, drawing it once, putting it in Photoshop, and then overlaying stuff. I mean, honestly, I don't know if you could have even really been able to do all that in 95. I just don't know if like the Wacom tablet technology was there to pull this off. And if it was, it would have been really, really digitized, I just don't see how it could have worked and still been able to get this level of like detail and not have a lot of pixelation in it. I could be wrong, but I feel like those type of computers and that type of digital artwork was still kind of in its infancy and not necessarily, the best way that you could have done this. And even if it was, it would have been super expensive. I could be wrong. And if I am, feel free to, correct me in the comments. My knowledge of where digital artwork was in 1995 is kind of limited. The last man points his gun directly at Deathblow and states, "You're not going to sucker punch me, Cray." And Deathblow says, "You're right, I won't," and then proceeds to kick him in the face, knocking him down a staircase. The man then drops his pistol and his billy club, and as he falls down the staircase and the other men are unconscious, Cray decides to arm himself, both with a pistol and a SPAS 12 shotgun, which should not be possible. I'll get to that later on in the video. He then opens up a panel and decides to start hot wiring some parts of the ship and says that they're not going to throw him in the brig and they're not going to just hang out the rest of his team to dry, as he's decided that he's going to take matters into his own hands. We're then teleported back to the monastery where we see the aftermath of the battle between Lynch and Grifter. Chang states, "Wow, Grifter, you and Lynch sure think a good fight." And Dane confirms, "Yeah, you brought down the entire building. That was pretty incredible. Is Lynch okay?" Grifter states that he thinks that Lynch is fine, but he's a little bit worried about the fact that they seem to have lost all contact with the ship that Deathblow is on. Slayton states that he doesn't like this one bit, and he feels that something is definitely wrong. Then we see that Callahan notices that all of the monks in the monastery have decided to leave and get the heck out of there, and states that it seems like they might have the right idea. It could also be the fact that they're terrified of the two men that just had a psychic battle that destroyed their entire monastery. That might be part of it too. At this point, Grifter starts to think that Slayton might be onto something and that there is something definitely wrong afoot and that he can feel something in the air that just seems off. Dane asks if he's starting to go a little crazy, and Grifter says, "No, open your mind, use your powers. Trust me, something's not right." At this point, their conversation is interrupted when they receive a transmission from none other than Deathblow, as he proceeds to tell them that Craven has indeed launched a low-yield Tomahawk nuke at their location, and that they've got about 10 minutes to figure out what they've got to do to survive. Grifter asks if Deathblow is now in control of the ship, and as we can see here, Deathblow has now tied his hand wielding the SPAS 12 to the back of the head of the captain, as he states, "Yeah, the captain and I have come to a bit of an understanding." Now, as I stated before, there's a problem with him having a SPAS 12 here, and that problem is that the SPAS 12 could not have possibly been here at the point in time that this should be taking place. They never gave us a direct year as to when this is supposed to be happening. However, we do know that the first issue of the Gen 13 miniseries starts in 1995 as Caitlin Fairchild, who is the daughter of Fairchild in Team 7, is graduating from her freshman year of college, which means she's about 18 years old. So if you subtract 18 from 1995, you get 1977. And we also know that none of the men in the Team 7 group had any children until after they were put through the Gen Active process and given their abilities. And then they passed those abilities down to their children and made them Gen Active individuals. This means that there's no way that this could have been happening before 1977 at the very latest. If Caitlin was born in late 1977, this could have been happening in early 77. Now, what does any of that have to do with this SPAS 12 shotgun? I'll tell you, the SPAS 12 didn't go into production until 1979. Now, many of you are probably thinking to yourselves at this point, "Bo, you're being rather pedantic." And to you, I say, yes, you're damn right. I'm very pedantic. They should have done a little bit more research. I understand the SPAS 12 is an iconic shotgun and it was being used in movies all the time. most notably in one of its most famous appearances in Jurassic Park. And a lot of people would have noticed it and thought, man, that's a cool looking shotgun. But it didn't exist until 1979, so there's no way that Deathblow could have had it in 77 or before. We then see a series of panels showing the Tomahawk cruise missile approaching their position, as Callahan starts to freak out, stating, all right, well, let's get in the Jeeps and ride. However, Dane immediately puts a kibosh on that plan, stating, look, man, even if we start riding now, we're not going to outrun the blast of even a low-yield nuke. Callahan starts to freak out a little and says, well, I mean, what are we supposed to be doing then? Just dying? And Dane says, yep, looks that way. However, during all of this conversation, we see that Grifter is just casually lighting up a smoke as he tells them all to calm down, shut up, and that there's a possibility that they can make it through this if they combine all of their powers together. He then splashes water on Lynch to wake him up. Lynch immediately comes to and states that Grifter's going to hang for this, but Grifter cuts him off, stating, look, Lynch, here's the situation. We've got a nuke headed our way because Craven's decided that the whole thing's a wash and he wants to scrub everything. And Lynch is kind of confused and states, wait a minute, is that serious? And Grifter states, yeah, man, this is a real deal thing. We've got a nuke heading straight for us. Lynch asks if anyone has a plan, to which Grifter replies, we do, but it's going to take all of our powers combined, including yours. Meanwhile, back on the ship, we see that Craven is rather furious about the fact that Deathblow has managed to completely take over the ship, as he reprimands him, stating, there's nothing you can do to save the rest of the team. Why don't you just give it up and stop trying to play the hero? However, Deathblow has no interest in hearing Craven's taunts, as he simply states, is anybody watching this? And then opens fire on the giant vid screen, blowing it up, and then states, yeah, I didn't think so, as he holds the gun up. Meanwhile, back in the desert, the other members of Team 7 join hands in a circle, as some of the men think that this is a corny idea, but Grifter reminds them that it's their only chance of surviving this nuke, and tells them to slowly bring up their powers and concentrate and focus on those powers to build a shield. Back in the desert, we see the missile getting closer and closer to the position of Team 7, as some of the men are still a little bit sketchy on whether or not any of this is going to work. However, Grifter tells them to shut up and focus, and to concentrate on building a shield around all of them, and that they make sure that it surrounds every portion of them, even underneath them, and to, no matter what, continue to focus on keeping that shield all around them as they then feel the impact of the nuclear explosion. We then see that the explosion creates the flash and the characteristic mushroom cloud, as it's stated that the temperature of the surrounding desert elevates to 5,000 degrees in a single second. Meanwhile, back on the ship, the men monitoring the desert confirm that the missile has made its impact and detonated. At this point, Deathblow is furious, trying to figure out answers, hoping beyond all hope that somehow his friends survived, but also knowing in the back of his head that it's almost certainly impossible, and then coming to the conclusion that Craven's not going to allow any of them to live. So he now faces the question of whether or not he's going to go quietly, or if he's going to take a few of the uniforms on the ship along with him for the ride, as we even see a tear shed from one of his eyes as he begins to fear the worst, and that all of his friends and comrades in arms are now dead. We then get to a pinup that is by Aaron Weisenfeld. We then take a look at this awesome 2-page pinup, and I know it's very minimalist and, just super blacked out in a lot of places, but I think it looks fantastic. I love the look of this. I would love to read an entire comic book in this style of artwork. I think it really fits well with the tone of the story, and I've always been a fan of this kind of black and white artwork, super heavy shadows, very akin to what you see in something like Sin City or other comic books like that. I love it, and I would love to see more of it. Unfortunately, black and white comics don't always really do that well in terms of sales numbers, so we don't see a lot of this thing that often. But I really like this, and I applaud Aaron Weisenfeld for doing something completely different in this issue and coming up with something a little bit more off the beaten path and unique for this pinup. We then get an advertisement for the New York Comic Book Spectacular at the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, I'm not sure how to say it, where Scott Clark is going to be there signing autographs. I don't know anything about this event or if it still takes place to this day, but if you have any information, feel free to talk about it in the comments section, even if you happen to be at this event. I'd really like to know how it went down and what your impressions of it were. We're then suddenly teleported to the Soviet Union, perhaps Moscow, perhaps another city. It's not really stated, where we're then brought to the bedroom of a man by the name of Rostov, who shoots up out of bed screaming. As his guards enter the room, worried that something is wrong, he states that something is definitely different, that something has changed in the world, something terrible and magnificent, speaking very cryptically as he's not sure exactly what he felt that made him so terrified, but he knows that it's something that will forever change everything going forward. Meanwhile, back in the desert, as the explosion debris begins to clear, we see that the men of Team 7 are in fact still alive, as they were able to surround themselves in a spherical psionic barrier that did in fact protect them all from the explosion, as Grifter tells them all to continue to hold and to block out the pain and the heat, inferring that despite the fact that they were protected from the blast, they can still feel the effects of the radical explosion that just happened around them. 6 hours later, we see two men standing in the desert looking at where the explosion took place through some binoculars, talking amongst themselves. One asks if they're in any danger where they're at, but the other responds by stating, while the background radiation levels are high, the wind is blowing all of the poison radioactive particles in an opposite direction from where they're standing. The man with the binoculars then wonders why it was that America would blow up a monastery for seemingly no reason with a nuclear missile. And the other man responds by stating, we don't know what their ways are. We only have two things to worry about: keeping an eye on this area and being ready, as we see the two of them have a rather large grouping of tanks and helicopters and soldiers all behind them, as the domestic military of this area is definitely on the ready. And why wouldn't they be? They just had a nuclear weapon detonated within their borders. Back on the ship, we see that Craven has actually deployed a group of Special Forces Marines to take back control of the vessel, as the Marines rappel down onto the deck, preparing for a fight with Deathblow. Back in the desert, we see that the military observing the blast zone suddenly notice that they see something coming out of the cloud of the explosion. As one of the men grabs a pair of binoculars and takes a closer look, he realizes to his utter amazement that somehow a small group of men are walking out of the dust cloud, as he can't fathom how anyone could have possibly survived such an explosion. And once again, back to the ship, we see Deathblow as he starts to look around and states, well, we have a bit of a predicament here, don't we? And a predicament he does have, as he finds himself completely surrounded by the Marines who have boarded the ship. However, Deathblow realizes that despite the fact that he's completely outnumbered and has no hope of fighting his way out of this, he hasn't lost all of his advantage, as the Marines surrounding him can't open fire without endangering and probably hitting the captain of the vessel. And he basically says, we've got a bit of a standoff here, boys. It's your move. However, at this point, all of them are interrupted when they begin to hear a series of beeps coming in over the Morse code. Deathblow counts them out and realizes that there are precisely 7 beats at the exact same interval. He realizes that this is his team contacting to let him know that they're all still alive and well. And when he figures this out, he then immediately gives himself up, putting his hand up to have a handcuff put on it, and then takes the time to tell all of the surrounding Marines that they can untie the captain and him from the shotgun, which, by the way, was completely unloaded the whole time, and that the captain was never in any real danger. He just needed a bargaining chip. Back in the desert, the extraction helicopter that is supposed to get Team 7 out of the desert finally shows up, and Lynch tells everyone to hop on board. However, Grifter and the rest of the team state that they're not going because they've decided they can't trust Craven anymore, as he basically just fired a nuclear weapon at them just to see if they could survive it. Lynch states that this isn't going to happen and that he's not going to allow the men to break rank. But Grifter states that, you don't really have any say in this, and we're going to do this the way we want to do it until we figure out exactly what's going on. Lynch states, he's not just going to let you guys walk off into the sunset. At no point will you ever be safe, and Craven's going to spend the rest of his life hunting you all down if he has to. But Grifter responds by stating, that's just a chance we're going to have to take. We're not going right back into the belly of the beast when we know that this guy's willing to kill us at a moment's notice if it serves his needs. Later on, we see Deathblow locked up in the brig as he waits to get back to the mainland, and he's being contacted on his television screen by Craven, who states that he's going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary and that he's as good as dead and buried, and that Craven's the only friend he has left, and that Craven is willing to overlook this insubordination and make Deathblow his right-hand man if Deathblow is willing to help him hunt down Grifter and the rest of the members of Team 7. However, Deathblow has no interest in turning on and selling out his friends, so he responds by simply punching the television screen and shattering it into a million pieces. Then we move to Nicaragua, as this is 6 months after the fact, and there's a small boy being taunted by some other boys in the village, stating that, oh, that's the burro your father gave you? That's just a toy. The boy responds by stating, no, my father will give me a real burro one day. He promised me. The other boys laugh and taunt him, stating that his father is poor and will never be able to afford such a thing. And then suddenly the toy burro starts to get up and dance around all on its own. All the children freeze and are completely shocked at what they're seeing. However, it's none other than Chang just playing a little trick on the kids, amusing himself as he and the other members of Team 7 have decided to hide out here in Nicaragua. Dane tells Chang to stop screwing around and messing with the kids, and Chang responds by stating, why the heck are we hanging out in this garbage part of the world when we could be hanging out, in some kind of tropical paradise? But Dane says it's because Craven and his buddies will find us if we do that. But Grifter quickly corrects Dane by stating that, Craven and his buddies are going to find us regardless. There's nowhere we can hide that they won't find us, and they're going to keep looking until they do. So maybe it's time that we went to them and started making the rules ourselves as we reach the end of the story, not knowing exactly how things play out to get them from this point to the point we see them in the mid-90s when they're all on their own individual super teams. We then get to the letter section called the debriefing, and most of the letters are just basic, nonchalant praise of how good everyone thought the miniseries was. However, there are a lot of readers who have a lot of questions about the characters and how those characters translate to other characters that exist in the Wildstorm universe in the future. Unfortunately, they don't get any real concrete answers, as the guys who are working on Team 7 want to leave some of that stuff mysterious because they plan on making other miniseries in the future, which they do, and I have those, and we will be making videos about those in the future if you stay tuned to the channel. The last page of the book is just more of the letter section, and on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Union. If you would like to know more about Union, and I advise you do because Union's an awesome character, you can check out my Union playlist. And that was Team 7 number 4. Overall, I thought it was a really good way to wrap up this initial miniseries. As I've stated in the past, Team 7 never got an ongoing series. It was always just random miniseries that got put out with their own self-contained stories, which I'm fine with. I feel like trying to make a ongoing monthly prequel series would have been really difficult and kind of unnecessary, given that we know where most of these characters wind up in the future. And, this is really just kind of showing us how their origins came to be. There are definitely a lot of questions. Obviously, we see that in this miniseries, Grifter has all these crazy, telekinetic powers and is so strong that he can actually level a building when doing battle with another telekinetic being. And we don't see him use any of those abilities in the Wildcats miniseries in the future. So it's the question of, does he still have those abilities or does he lose them at some point? We're not really certain. And, you know, I don't know that this will give us answers in the ongoing miniseries because I've never read all of these miniseries. You're getting my initial thoughts on them in real time when I make these videos, because I've only recently been able to acquire all of the Team 7 issues that I didn't have. So there's still a lot of questions that need answered, and maybe some of them will get answered and maybe some of them won't, but we'll just have to find out as we read. But like I said, I really think that, you know, in the end, this was a really cool and interesting miniseries, and I really enjoyed the idea of showing all of these guys working as this cohesive special ops military unit in the past, and then that kind of gives us a really good basis of how exactly they got to be in charge of or part of these like over-the-top superhero teams in the future. But then again, these are just my opinions. You may not like the Team 7 series at all and think that it's cliche or think that it's stupid that all of these guys just happen to be in these crack military roles and then somehow find their way onto like super teams in the future, and that it all seems a little bit contrived. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.